Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
National unity. It has been present as a theme in Canadian politics throughout our history. This federal election campaign is no exception. With the specter of Donald Trump's threats to Canadian sovereignty hanging over our heads, a national unity crisis right now is the last thing this country needs. When we talk about separatism in Canada, most people will think of Quebec, where in the 20th century there were two separate referendums on Quebec leaving the Federation. But in more recent history, there's been a growing separatist movement as well in Western Canada, with provincial governments in Alberta and Saskatchewan increasingly at odds with the federal government in Ottawa. Is national unity on the line in this federal election? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, taking a look at separatist sentiment in different Canadian provinces and examining how it plays into the current federal election race. I'm joined today by Jon Roe, Research Associate with the Angus Reid Institute. Hello, Jon. Welcome back.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me on again.
Yeah, so you have new public opinion research on the threat of a possible national unity crisis. For this survey, you asked if people want to see their province separate from the rest of Canada right now, and you also asked what they would think of separation if Mark Carney and the Liberals were to form the next federal government. So right now, which provinces have the most baseline support for separatism?
Overall, it's I think what people would expect is it's really high in Quebec. About 28% in that province say that they would want their country or their province to leave the country and become its own independent country. But it's also really high in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Two places where, there hasn't ever been a referendum in Alberta or Saskatchewan. Historically, there have been two in Quebec. But fueled, I think, by this view that the national government, the federal government by the Liberals, has somewhat been negative towards those provinces, has not helped them out economically, has put forward policies that have hurt their development of their economics and their industries in those provinces. And we've also seen in those two provinces kind of big steps from the governments there to kind of carve out where provincial jurisdiction is. So in Alberta, that was the Sovereignty Act, and then Saskatchewan had a similar act that they passed around the same time.
Yeah, so baseline support, 28% in Quebec, no surprise there, but 25% in Alberta, 20% next door in Saskatchewan. So there's this baseline of support above 20% in those two western provinces that we simply don't see elsewhere. In BC, it's only 9%, Manitoba 8%, Ontario 6%, and Atlantic Canada 7%. So we're seeing traditional separatist sentiment in Quebec, I think, but this new growing sense of it in the western provinces as well. And then when you put to people the scenario where Mark Carney is the next prime minister and the Liberals form a fourth government, consecutive government in Ottawa, what happens to the support for separatism under that scenario?
It's relatively the same in Quebec. Before that scenario is 28%, afterwards is 30%. But in Alberta and Saskatchewan, it grows considerably. In Alberta, 30% said they would want their province, or they would vote yes in a referendum if their province was leaving the country to join, just to leave the country. If Mark Carney wins the next election and the Liberals win the next election, it goes up to 33% in Saskatchewan. So does seem to be a bit more appetite for separatism because I think, again, it gets back to this feeling in those provinces where people feel like the Liberals haven't treated their provinces very well. And if they have another 4 years of it, potentially under a Mark Carney majority government, things would get bad or worse.
And what do you think is driving that? Because it hasn't cropped up out of nowhere. As I understand it, and you're there in Calgary, just so the listeners know you're in Alberta, there has been an historic political dissatisfaction with the federal government in Ottawa, in Alberta, and also in Saskatchewan. Can you speak to that a little bit? How deeply rooted is that in the political culture out there?
Yeah, it is very deeply rooted, I would say, especially in Alberta. I obviously know that province a little bit better than neighboring Saskatchewan, but we've seen somewhat similar sentiment in Saskatchewan in many ways over the same period of time. And we had polled about in Alberta, asking about separatism, Western alienation, these feelings that people don't feel like the federal government is treating their province fairly, or whether they're respected by the rest of the country, whether people feel that their province gives too much to confederation compared to other provinces. In Alberta, those feelings are always and have been very high. In 2019, we did see some of a backlash in the sense that the government changed over in Alberta. It went from an NDP government to the UCP under Jason Kenney. And Jason Kenney came in with his government and said, "Hey, we're going to strike a fair deal panel. We want a better deal from Ottawa. Here's all these things that we want to put in place to somewhat assert our own sovereignty within Canada in a lot of ways." They were looking at things like provincial police force, their own taxation collection, all these things. And it was coming after a lot of people felt the federal government were putting a lot of barriers in the way of Alberta economic development in the form of blocking pipelines in their view. So there was the Bill C-69, which in Alberta was labeled the No More Pipelines Act, but it is about environmental assessments. The people in Alberta in the oil and gas industry feel it puts too many barriers in front of new pipelines. So in the wake of all of that and the cancellation of Energy East, all these things, there was a lot of the sentiment that people in Alberta felt like we're giving too much to this country, and they're also blocking our economic development. So what is, I think, somewhat interesting is a lot of those questions that we asked in 2019, there's a lot more feeling of disrespect in 2019 than 2024. One of the questions we asked then and now is the percentage of people who agree that the province is treated fairly by the national government. In Alberta in 2019, it was 17%. Only 17% in Alberta believed that their province was treated fairly by the national government. Now it's 36%, which is still low compared to the rest of the country. But it is interesting that the feelings of disrespect were a lot higher in 2019 than now, but they're still obviously evident now.
Yeah, and in 2019, was there more or less support for separatism back in 2019? You know, that was shortly after the cancellation of Energy East. It was when Trans Mountain Pipeline was in jeopardy at that time. What I'm trying to get at, though, is that here we are a few years later, post-pandemic, removed from those events with the pipelines. Has the support increased or decreased in Alberta for separation in the last 5-6 years?
Arguably, I would say it has decreased in some ways, but what we are lacking is somewhat of an apples to apples comparison in questions that we asked. So we didn't ask at the time, would you vote for your province to leave the country? So we don't have that question to compare for to today. What we do have is in 2019, we asked people if you would be in favor or opposed of your own province joining a Western separatist movement. So that would be a larger movement where, say, BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba all came together as like a separate entity somehow. So we were looking at things like, okay, maybe there'd be a Western political party, all these kind of different elements to it. And at that time, it was about 60% in Alberta that said that they would be in favor of their province joining a Western separatist movement. So again, it's not quite an apples to apples comparison. It is a different question, but there was a lot more interest at the time in joining the separatist movement. Of course, it's easier to express interest than, say, answering the question, would you vote yes in a referendum to leave the country, which is a little bit more pointed in a lot of ways. But there was a lot more interest at the time, I would say, in Western separatism in Alberta specifically.
What about if we compare it to Quebec, where at one time, in the last referendum in 1995, it was a full 49.5% of Quebecers voted in that referendum to leave Canada. You're not seeing numbers in Alberta anywhere close to that, right?
No, definitely not. It is still a minority opinion. Even in the event that the Liberals do win the election and form the next government, it's still a 30% in Alberta that say they would vote yes for their province to leaving the country. So it's not nearly at the same level that we did see in Quebec. And yeah, comparing the two, I think at the height of separatism in Quebec, at the height of that national movement there, it was obviously a lot more popular. And even Quebec today, I would argue that separatism there is not nearly as popular as it was 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Danielle Smith, the premier, was asked about this polling on Monday afternoon. Let's take a listen to this and we'll talk about how the premier handled this question.
You've said that you won't lead a referendum, but where do you stand on this? Do you want Alberta to leave Canada?
Well, I want Canada to work. I want Canada to be able to meet its potential. I want for us to be able to build economic corridors. I want us to be able to develop all of our resources from oil and gas all the way through to critical minerals and beyond. But I also want Canada to work for Alberta, and it hasn't for the last 10 years because of terrible policies by the Liberals. And so I put forward a list of 9 items that I think would allow for us to have a reset in our relationship with the Federation, depending on who wins in 3 weeks' time. And that stands today. Those are some very basic things if we want to actually move to that reality of making Canada an economic powerhouse and supporting Alberta in particular. So I really hope that we can get Canada on Team Alberta, because Team Alberta has always been on Team Canada.
I really hope we can get Team Canada on Team Alberta, because Team Alberta has always been on Team Canada. What do you think of that turn of phrase from Premier Smith?
Yeah, it really is interesting, and I think it does get back to those points about how people view the barriers put in front of Alberta by Liberal governments, successive Liberal governments, to their own economic development. And that Danielle Smith kind of speaks to that, where she's wanting from this next government, whoever it is that goes in, to maybe build more pipelines, to remove some of the barriers to getting those big projects done, and maybe accelerating those projects to get Alberta oil across the country or to the different seaboards, all those things. But she really is, the interesting thing I think for her is that she has to strike this line because she has been out there somewhat insinuating that she would be calling a referendum for Alberta independence. But I don't think she wants to go out and say that directly, because there is already a lot of negative views towards Danielle Smith about her different expeditions to the United States recently. A lot of people don't view that very positively. And there's already a lot of people who have called her a traitor just for talking to Americans who view Canada as potentially should be the 51st state of the U.S. So I think she's trying to strike that balance where she's advocating for Alberta and saying that, hey, we need support from the federal government to get our economic projects built to help boost the economy, and everyone in Canada would benefit from that, or in her view, because it would it would increase GDP across the country. But she doesn't want to be seen as threatening separation in a lot of ways, and threatening things that she has kind of insinuated in some ways earlier in earlier weeks.
And interestingly enough, you did ask about the U.S. in this context of separatist sentiment. So among those people who say they would vote for their province to leave Canada, you also asked whether they think their province ought to be an independent nation or join the U.S. So is there more support for becoming an independent country or for joining the United States?
Yeah, there's definitely more support for becoming an independent country, but that is somewhat skewed by the fact that the separatist sentiment is very high in Quebec, but with 28% of people saying that they would vote to become an independent country. But there's very few people in Quebec that would want to join the United States, only 11% in Quebec. So that somewhat skews it in some ways, that there are more people that want their province to become an independent country than join the United States. But I would say arguably in everywhere else other than Quebec, the two concepts are almost universally somewhat close to each other in percentages. So in Alberta, it's 25% say they would want to become an independent country. 22% believe they should join the United States. In Saskatchewan, 20% independent country, 17% to join the United States. So those numbers aren't that different. And we do see the similar thing when we ask again about, okay, if the Liberals form government after the next election. In Alberta, it's 30% independent country, 27% join the United States. So in some ways, overall, being an independent country is more popular among Canadians than joining the United States. But those numbers are very close in a lot of the provinces where we ask that question.
Yeah, and that's reflected as well in the partisan divide, because you also break it down based on federal vote intention. But this is not broken down by province. This is just national numbers. And it says here that for conservative voters, the number of people who think that that their province should separate is and become independent is 22. It's actually higher for separate and join the United States at 27%. But again, that's very skewed because most people in the prairie provinces are conservative voters, right?
Yeah, that's a big part of it. So it is a more popular idea among conservatives for Canada to be, for their province to leave the country and join the United States or become an independent country in general. And we've seen that as well when we've asked different questions about if Canada should become the 51st state. It put the question in a different way, not partitioning off the country individually by provinces, but the whole country. Conservatives were much more likely to say that they support that idea as well. Conservatives are more likely to say they have a favorable view of Donald Trump. So there is a bit more, I think, appeal to that notion among a certain segment of conservative voters. But again, I think it's worth noting, too, that 27% of the conservatives that want to join the United States, that's still a minority among there, but it is a much larger minority than we see among other partisans.
Yeah, for the Liberal Party, it's 1%. Just 1% of Liberal voters say, sure, let's join the United States. So that may, inform some of this conversation we've been having in the course of the federal election campaign about the liberal tone versus the conservative tone on the U.S. On that note, there is a very immediate political impetus here. Canadians will choose a new government in about 3 weeks from now, and based on the latest polling, it could very well be a fourth Liberal government taking power in Ottawa. In a recent column for the Globe and Mail, the former leader of the Reform Party, Preston Manning, warned that a national unity crisis is on the line in this federal election. Preston Manning writes, quote, "Whether politicians, the media, or voters in central Canada realize it or not, the greatest future threat to national unity is emerging not from Quebec, but on the Western Front. Voters, particularly in central and Atlantic Canada, need to recognize that a vote for the Carney Liberals is a vote for Western secession, and a vote for the breakup of Canada as we know it," end quote. So that's just Mr. Manning's personal opinion, which he's free to share and publish. But based on the actual data that you have here, John, do you think there's something to that narrative that Mr. Manning has put forward with regards to the outcome of the election?
I think he's somewhat overstating it, but there is certainly a minority in both Alberta and Saskatchewan that is fairly sizable that are looking at this and saying, like, if the Liberals win the next election, we should be looking at ways to leave the country, to maybe join the United States. I think it's not a majority belief, a majority movement, but it does seem like there's certainly that feeling in those two provinces. But I think what's missing from that piece is that Daniel Smith came out with a series of requests for whoever the next federal government is. And maybe Mark Carney comes in and says, okay, I understand people in Alberta and Saskatchewan are upset about what happened in the federal election. Once again, they voted Conservative probably by a significant margin. Maybe they lose. If Mark Carney comes in and says, okay, well, we're going to do these things, maybe he can stop that movement and maybe appease some people in Alberta. But I think there's among Albertans, among especially those who view that this election is a question of national unity, there isn't a lot of trust among Albertans that the next Liberal government is going to come in and help them out or even do what Daniel Smith has asked of them. So I think what I would say, I guess, is that Preston Manning's probably overstating it. I think that there is certainly a group of people out there in Alberta and Saskatchewan that do feel that way, but it's not necessarily a wide movement in the sense that there's going to be a referendum and it will pass somehow. Like, again, even with if the Liberals win the next election, 30% in Alberta said they would want to vote to leave the country, 33% in Saskatchewan. So those numbers speak to the existence of that sentiment, but it's not, I think, not nearly as dire as maybe Preston Manning is indicating in his column.
Okay. All right. Thank you so much for your time today, Jon Roe from the Angus Reid Institute. It's been a pleasure digging into some of this data with you and shedding some light on what's driving that separatist sentiment in Western Canada and what the implications are in this federal election. Thank you so much for your time today, John.
Thanks for having me on.
Again, that is Jon Roe, research associate with the Angus Reid Institute. And that is the big story for today. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode of the show. You can email us hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca or leave a voicemail at 416-935-5935. You can find us on the Seeker app or any of your other favorite podcast platforms. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.